stuff is going to stand up and successfully make it through next summer, and we're going to continue down a path we're hoping to see.
So we will leave this hearing at this point. Live coverage continues online at cspan.org. Live now to the U.S. House as members are returning for legislative work. 5 bills on the agenda. We're also hearing that the budget deal will be debated on the House floor tomorrow. Live to the House.
By our chaplain, Father Conroy.
Let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for giving us another day. You have blessed us with all good gifts, and with thankful hearts we express our gratitude. You have created us with opportunities to serve other people in their need, to share together in respect and affection, and to be faithful in the responsibilities we have been given. In this moment of prayer, please grant to the members of this people's house the gifts of wisdom and discernment, that in their words and actions they will do justice, love with mercy, and walk humbly with you. May all that is done this day be for your greater honor and glory. Amen.
The Chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina rise?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Clause 1, Rule 1, I demand a vote on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal.
The question is on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal. Those in favor indicate by saying aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The journal stands approved. The gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, I object to the vote on the grounds that a quorum is not present and make the point of order that a quorum is not present.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed. Pledge of allegiance today will be led by the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Holkren.
Ask my colleagues to join me in honoring our great nation and recognizing our freedom. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The Chair will entertain up to 15 requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to recognize Computer Science Education Week. On Monday, I participated in an International Hour of Code. PJ, a 12-year-old programming genius, helped me write basic computer code for the game Angry Birds. Elgin Technology Center staff, along with local robotics team mentor Carol McKellar, organized an important educational event for students eager about coding. If these kids can accomplish what we did in just an hour, imagine how far students could go if computer science were more accessible at a younger age. Currently, software jobs outnumber students 3 to 1. Teaching coding can help fill employers' growing needs for graduates in computing fields. And coding is not just for computer scientists. Fields such as advanced manufacturing require workers skilled in computer science. If I can learn, it shows anyone can learn to code. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentlelady from Oregon seek recognition?
Request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in this holiday season of compassion and giving, we must not forget those who are still suffering from the effects of the worst recession to hit our country since the Great Depression. Although the recent news about job creation is cause for optimism and the budget negotiations look promising, there are still too many trying every day to find work to allow them to put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads. We must pass an extension of unemployment insurance. Unless we take action, millions of Americans, thousands of them Oregonians, will see their unemployment benefits end in a few short weeks. Remember, benefits are contingent on continued job search. Our constituents are searching, but if they're still out of work, they're about to lose a lifeline. We can't let that happen. I encourage House leadership to bring a resolution to the floor that will continue unemployment insurance for another year. We must act now. This is no time to end assistance to millions of Americans who are out of work through no fault of their own. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. What purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend my remarks.
The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, people across America are hurting because Obamacare is destroying jobs. Thousands of residents from North Augusta to Blythewood in South Carolina's 2nd Congressional District have appealed for answers to the difficulties they are facing because of the government health care takeover. Kathleen Sebelius has failed. Over the weekend, I heard from constituents who are applying for a second or third job because their current income will not cover the increased cost of health care. Others have shared stories of sticker shock because they pay 3 times more for the same coverage. Concerns have been vindicated by the projections of job losses by the National Federation of Independent Business because of the health care takeover. We must repeal and replace Obamacare with a patient-centered plan that creates jobs, which has been long proposed by Congressman Dr. Tom Price and puts personal health care decisions back into the people's hands. In conclusion, God bless our troops, and we'll never forget September 11th and the global war on terrorism. Congratulations, First Lieutenant Hunter Wilson, for completing his service this year in Afghanistan.
Gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentlelady from Illinois seek recognition?
For 1 minute.
Gentlelady is recognized for a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of over 1 million Americans to urge my colleagues to extend unemployment insurance benefits so that they can continue to meet their basic needs while searching for work. Last week, we were encouraged by the labor report that showed the economy was adding jobs. The unemployment rate is shrinking and companies are again investing, but there is still work to be done. For the 11 million Americans without a job, the economy is still in a state of emergency. When a mom in Chicago or a dad in Kankakee loses their job, the whole family feels it. I've met with many people from Illinois with impressive qualifications who are weary from the job search. They want what we all want, a good job, a livable wage, and a Congress that will work to create new economic opportunities. But until that's achieved, they're asking for a hand up, not a handout in these tough times. It is for these Americans that I urge my colleagues to extend unemployment insurance benefits now, because every citizen deserves support in their pursuit of the American dream. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. What purpose does the gentlelady from North Carolina seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What we know is this. On January 1, millions of Americans are scheduled to lose the health insurance plans they liked and wanted to keep. Nowhere near that many have managed to enroll in Obamacare. Because Washington said those plans would be illegal on January 1, health care providers followed the law and took steps to cancel millions of plans on schedule. But President Obama and Secretary Sebelius haven't been ready with a functioning alternative, and certainly not an affordable alternative for the millions of Americans who will be without coverage on January 1 because of Obamacare. No one wants to see a situation where fewer Americans have coverage, but forcing an unready law and unwanted alternatives on the American people might just have unintended consequences. So what's the President's plan? The American people are tired of waiting for clarity from an administration that keeps waiting until the last minute to change its mind and announce the next big delay. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. What purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, diabetes cost the U.S. economy $245 billion. That number will only continue to climb unless Congress supports critical medical research and treatment initiatives like the Special Diabetes Program. The Special Diabetes Program contributes to the groundbreaking research at the National Institute of Health. Continued investment in this program will bring hope for a cure and a better life to the 26 million Americans living with diabetes. The Special Diabetes Program also funds treatment, education, and prevention programs for American Indian and Alaska Native families who are disproportionately affected by diabetes. We must continue our commitment to fighting this deadly disease. Without a timely, multi-year renewal, work that could save hundreds of thousands of lives is put at risk. I urge my colleagues to support legislation to renew the Special Diabetes Program. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back her time. What purpose does the gentlelady from Indiana seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I request 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Gentlelady asks for unanimous consent. Does the gentlelady ask for unanimous consent?
Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, we still have a lot of improving to do. While last week's job reports showed some encouraging signs, there is more work to be done. What are the House Republicans doing to help? Well, for one, we want to get government out of the way of economic growth. We want to curb the excessive regulations coming out of Washington, D.C. We want to protect Americans from the harmful effect of Obamacare. And with so many Americans still struggling to make ends meet, it's not fair that Washington Democrats want to force people to pay more for their own health care. What's more, policy cancellation, technical problems have left many Americans unsure if they've even covered it all. It's not going to help our economy. We need real pro-growth solutions that will create more jobs and give all Americans a fair shot. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. What purpose does the gentlelady from Hawaii seek recognition? Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to commend the work that's been done by Senator Murray and Congressman Ryan as we work towards hopefully passing a budget deal before the end of this year. I think the end result is not perfect in anyone's eyes, but what they have done is something that symbolizes what can be achieved when two sides come together in the best interest for our country. There's one element of the agreement that I am raising with concern because my state of Hawaii has a very unique circumstance. We have 6 major islands where people live, with no inter-island railway, no highway or ferry system that connect each of these islands, and people who commute back and forth, people who look for access to health care, have no option other than to fly. And in some cases, this air route is an essential lifeline in each of these areas. In the past, Congress has recognized Hawaii's unique situation and exclusive reliance on air travel, and we're concerned about the disparate impact of increased taxes and fees on this air travel in our state. Again, the budget deal is a solid step in the right direction, but we must ensure that the people of Hawaii who have no options available to them other than to fly are not unduly burdened with a fee increase. I look forward to being able to address this issue. Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. What purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise and ask for unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of Senate Bill 1471, the Alicia Koehl Respect for National Cemeteries Act. I thank my Indiana colleagues, Senator Dan Coates and Congresswoman Susan Brooks, for their hard work. The namesake of this bill is Alicia Koehl. She was the wife of Fort Wayne native Paul Koehl from my district and the mother of 2 children. She was also the daughter-in-law of Frank and Carol Koehl. Last year, Alicia was tragically murdered, and after her killer, an Army veteran, committed suicide, he was buried in a national cemetery with military honors despite laws prohibiting such distinction. This bill provides the Department of Veteran Affairs the authority to right such wrongs, ensuring our national cemeteries are reserved for our country's most deserving heroes. Mr. Speaker, my sympathies go out to the family and friends of Ms. Koehl. It is impossible for any of us here today to fully grasp the hardship they have needlessly endured. I respectfully urge my colleagues to support this legislation. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentlelady from Nevada seek recognition?
Unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise today on behalf of the nearly 40,000 unemployed Nevadans at risk of losing their benefits if Congress fails to act before the end of the year. While our economy has slowly begun to recover from the recession and housing crisis, there are still 1.3 million fewer jobs today than when the recession started 6 years ago. Nearly 4 million jobless Americans have been unemployed for more than 27 weeks. And while a newly unemployed worker has a 20 to 30% chance of getting hired, a long-term unemployed worker has only a 1 in 10 chance of finding a new job in any given month. Cutting off a critical lifeline to those already struggling to make ends meet would be irresponsible and reckless, causing significant damage to our economic growth and costing our economy nearly 310,000 jobs, including 3,000 in Nevada.
I'm proud to co-sponsor the Emergency Unemployment Compensation Extension Act that would extend this vital program and related provisions for another year. So before Congress pats itself on the back about a budget deal, let's think of those families truly in need during these holidays and beyond. I yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired. What purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Speaker, I unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as our nation's economy continues to improve, we still need to have a serious discussion about jobs in this country. As Congress will soon debate on whether to extend unemployment benefits for needy Americans, we must remember that there are young people that are graduating from high schools in our country that are not ready to take jobs that are in high demand. For instance, from an article I read in the Wall Street Journal last year, an estimated 600,000 skilled middle-class manufacturing jobs went unfilled in this country. That's absolutely unacceptable. Much of that can be attributed to kids who are simply unprepared. Mr. Speaker, improved education must be included if we are serious about rebuilding the middle class in this country. And if we're really serious about looking out for the middle class, we have to do something about raising the minimum wage in this country. Any serious discussion about raising the standard of living in our country without addressing these two areas of education and raising the low minimum wage that we have is simply not addressing the issue seriously. Mr. Speaker, I'm trying to address these issues by having a job fair in my district on Friday, January the 24th in Fort Worth at the Resource Connection. It's efforts like these and many others that will help get the middle class back on track in this country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman's time has expired. What purpose does the gentlelady from Kansas seek recognition?
Seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Stop talking, start doing. That is what Gabriella Miller, a passionate childhood cancer advocate, asked of our nation's leaders. As an original co-sponsor of the Gabriella Miller Kids First Research Act, I encourage my colleagues to honor her request and support this piece of legislation. The bill directs $126 million to fund a new pediatric research initiative at the National Institutes of Health. These dollars will fund research, clinical trials, and medical advancements aimed at discovering better treatments to help kids fight their battles against childhood diseases. In my state, the University of Kansas Medical Center is making great strides in the fight against pediatric illnesses, including plans for a pediatric blood cancer program, research to prevent severe behavior disorders in children, and efforts to establish an Institute for Children's Health and Development. Although Gabriella lost her battle to brain cancer in October, this bill supports programs that will find cures for brave kids like her. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. What purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, our lives will go on, but the life of the world community was forever changed by the life of Nelson Mandela, who passed away this week. He chose the principles of truth and reconciliation and democracy and peace through justice to guide his life. And he was willing to give his life for those principles. It's unfortunate that the United States didn't support world sanctions against South Africa. I would hope if we had the opportunity to oppose apartheid wherever it exists throughout the world again, that we would follow the lead of Nelson Mandela. So treating people differently because of their race or their class or their religion is simply wrong. And the way that we honor Nelson Mandela best is to follow his principles. He transformed this world. We have the opportunity now to learn from his life and to follow his principles. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Permission to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of Computer Science Education Week, a time in which educators, businesses, policymakers, and communities can come together to celebrate the important role of computer science. In the next 10 years, there'll be more than 1 million more computer science jobs than we have students studying computer sciences. We need to address that gap. That's why Representative Brooks and I introduced the Computer Science Education Act, H.R. 2536. Without creating any new federal programs or requiring any new spending, our bill would allow existing federal funding to support computer science programs across our schools. This week, students across the country can try out computer science by participating in the Hour of Code. On Monday in my district in St. Vrains, Colorado, students worked with Oracle to develop apps to help get K-8 students excited about computer science. At CU Boulder, college students designed their own video games that allows people with no coding experience to create their own worlds. Through the National Council of Women and Information Technology in my district, more than 300 companies are working to increase the participation of girls and women in computing. I hope you join me in supporting Computer Science Education Week either by participating in the Hour of Code or supporting the Computer Science Education Act. I yield back the balance of my time.
What purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
Revising to my remarks.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise today to wish a happy birthday or happy anniversary to an organization that is actually helping people. 75 years ago, the Wagner-O'Day Act was signed here in the United States Congress. It's now known as the Ability One program, honoring each individual person across our country with unique disabilities to be able to say, as a nation, we're going to stand with you on that. I believe firmly that every individual evaluates success in a different way, but I think part of how they evaluate success is, do they have a great family experience? Do they have a great community of friends around them? Are they deep in their own personal faith? And do they have work that is meaningful? The Ability One program, and what's happening specifically in my state, an organization connected to them called New View, Oklahoma, they're helping people have great value and understanding that people that are blind and visually impaired can have great success in life, can contribute to society. They're producing products that are sold commercially into government that are all over the world. In fact, 2 years ago I was in Afghanistan, and when we landed, as we got off the back of the aircraft there was one of the bright yellow chalks that is uniquely made in Oklahoma by people that are blind and visually impaired. This is a great gift that we're doing, and I wish them happy anniversary. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. What purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? Does the gentleman ask for unanimous consent?
I do.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to call on Speaker Boehner to allow passage of the comprehensive immigration reform legislation. It is vital that we approach the issue of immigration with a sense of urgency, a spirit of compassion, and a commitment to security. Most important, reform must provide a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants and allow them to emerge from the shadows. My congressional office has one of the highest volumes of immigration cases in California, and the stories that are shared with me are heartbreaking. I receive calls from constituents every day describing the hardships that our broken immigration system has placed on their family, and I've heard their pleas for help. The current wait time for many family members to reunite the United States can be 10 years or more. Dreamers who come to the United States as young children and are pursuing a college degree or serving in the military have limited or no career opportunities and are stuck in endless limbo. Our broken immigration system takes a terrible toll on innocent families, local law enforcement, and our economy. We must not further delay action. The time to fix it is now. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition? The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As members of the House reach their conclusions on the budget deal announced by Congressman Ryan and Senator Murray, a deal, I might add, devoid of any support for the unemployed, real investment in jobs and education, tax reform that produces fairness, and pushing additional burden on federal employees, cost burdens, but it does avoid cuts to Social Security and Medicare, and the Republican-inspired government shutdown and near default. I want to remind my colleagues in the House that that same kind of effort, attention, and risk is needed on the issue of comprehensive immigration reform. If we can produce a budget deal through the crisis that we've been through, then it's time for the House of Representatives and the Republican leadership to step up and produce the same kind of effort, the same kind of attention to one of the most critical domestic issues affecting so many families and communities in this country, and that is the question of comprehensive immigration reform. So if we have the fortitude, the risk to compromise on a budget, we should certainly be able to do that for immigration reform. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentlelady from New Hampshire seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. The National Institute of Health has helped make America one of the great engines of biomedical discovery. NIH funding is critical for NIH to sustain its mission of improving health through scientific breakthroughs and maintain our international leadership. I'm proud that some of the world's best scientific research is taking place right here in New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, life-saving research at Dartmouth College and UNH is made possible by NIH grants. Unfortunately, the first year of sequestration required NIH to cut 5% of its budget. Many of America's young scientists are leaving the U.S. to pursue their research abroad for more stable positions. If the sequestration were to continue for the full 10 years, NIH would lose a staggering $19 billion, and our nation would lose precious time in its race against Alzheimer's disease, cancer, autism, HIV/AIDS, and countless other diseases that cause pain and suffering. I urge congressional leaders to approve robust funding for NIH to reverse the damaging impact of sequestration on research programs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. What purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition? Does the gentlelady ask for unanimous consent? Yes, sir. Gentlelady from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Affordable Care Act is moving in the right direction and delivering what the law was intended to do: deliver a wider range of medical services to all Americans, including improved access to mental health services. The administration announced that $100 million of additional funding would be made available to expand and improve the way Americans receive mental health services. According to the California Health Care Foundation, nearly 1 in 6 California adults has a mental health need, and approximately 1 in 20 suffers from a serious mental illness that makes it difficult to carry out major life activities. The rate among children is higher, where 1 in 13 suffers from a mental illness that limits participation on daily activities. While most mental illnesses are treatable, those with mental illness often struggle to get needed treatment if they do not have health insurance that covers mental health services. Starting next year, insurers would not be able to deny coverage on or charge an individual more than due to pre-existing health conditions, including mental illnesses. The health care law would also require most health plans to cover recommended preventive services like depression, screening for adults, and behavior assessment for children at no cost to the
Fired.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives. Sir, I wish to resign from my assignments to the House Committee on the Judiciary, the House Committee on Natural Resources, and House Committee on Veterans Affairs, effective the week of December 9, 2013. My resignation is in order to facilitate my appointment to the House Committee on Appropriations. Thank you for the opportunity. Sincerely, Mark E. Amadei.
Without objection, the resignations are accepted. The chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives. Sir, please accept this letter as resignation from my seats on the House Committee on Agriculture, the House Committee on Armed Services, and the House Committee on Education and the Workforce. I thank you for the opportunity to serve on these important committees. I remain committed to supporting my district's unique military, agriculture, and educational interests in my new capacity on the House Committee on Appropriations. Sincerely, Martha Roby, Member of Congress.
Without objection, the resignations are accepted. The chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives. Sir, as you are aware, the Steering Committee acted last week on my request to join the Appropriations Committee. in order to move on the Appropriations Committee and writing to resign from my current committee assignments, including all subcommittees on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, the Homeland Security Committee, and the Natural Resources Committee. I have truly enjoyed my service on these committees. I similarly look forward to serving on the Appropriations Committee. Sincerely, Chris Stewart.
Without objection, the resignations are accepted. What purpose does the gentlelady from Kansas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the House Republican Conference, I send to the desk a privileged resolution and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Resolution 437. Resolved
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading.
Without objection. Without objection, the resolution is agreed to. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to Clause 8, Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on motions to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6, Rule 20. Recorded votes on postponed questions will be taken later. Does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2319 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 207, H.R. 2319, a bill to clarify certain provisions of the Native American Veterans Memorial Establishment Act of 1994.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Mullen, and the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have up to 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he wishes to consume.
H.R. 2319 is a bill that would continue to recognize the efforts of all Native American, Alaska Native, and Hawaiian veterans across the nation. These brave soldiers, including my own grandfather, Kenneth Morris, sacrificed much for the country they love. It is important that we properly honor these brave soldiers and tell their story for generations to come. As many of my colleagues know, last month Congress awarded congressional gold medals to Native American code talkers from all over the country, a long overdue recognition for their bravery and valor. These men saved countless lives during World Wars I and II by using their native languages. My bill amends a 1994 law that allows the National Museum of American Indian more flexibility to design and raise funds for the building of a memorial. The memorial is currently authorized to be constructed inside the confines of the museum, but with limited space within the museum itself, this bill provides for a more appropriate tribute. This bipartisan bill has received overwhelming support from the National Congress of American Indians and the National Museum of American Indian. As one of only 2 Native Americans in Congress, it has been my privilege to work to make this memorial a reality. I ask for your support of this legislation, which was reported by unanimous consent from the Committee on Natural Resources just last week, and will require no cost to the American taxpayers. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
And I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he wishes to consume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. H.R. 2319 authorizes the construction of a Native American Veterans Memorial on the grounds of the National Museum of the American Indian. The memorial is already authorized to be built within the museum, but planning efforts have identified the need for more space. This bill simply allows the memorial to be built outside. Native Americans have a long and proud tradition of military service. Navajo code talkers were involved in every assault the U.S. Marines conducted in the Pacific from 1942 to 1945. Their heroics even inspired a Hollywood movie. But the proud tradition of Native American service goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War. Since the nation's first Americans have fought in every U.S. engagement, and it's about time that we recognize their service with a national memorial. I cannot think of a better place to commemorate that tradition than on the grounds of the National Museum. I also want to take time to thank Congressman Mullen for his leadership and sponsorship of this legislation, overdue and very, very appropriate and historically necessary. We support H.R. 2319, urge its passage, and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Arizona reserves his time. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
I appreciate the bipartisan support from my colleague from Arizona, and definitely the support from the other side of the aisle. So often is needed inside this, inside this House. At this time, I'd like to yield as much time as the gentleman may consume from North Dakota, Mr. Kramer.
The gentleman from North Dakota is recognized for as much time as he wishes to consume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly want to thank my friend and colleague from Oklahoma. He's a colleague on the Natural Resources Committee with me, as well as the Indian and Alaska Native Affairs Subcommittee. And Mr. Mullen has demonstrated great leadership on this important legislation. You know, in my state of North Dakota, our citizens enlist in the military at a rate 4 times the national average. Much of the credit for this impressive statistic really belongs to the thousands of our Native citizens who have enlisted at very, very high rates. Citizens from the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, from the Fort Berthold, Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara Nation, from our Sioux nations at Fort Yates and Fort Totten, the Standing Rock and Spirit Lake nations, as well as Wahpeton, Sisseton Sioux Nation, who've demonstrated exemplary patriotism in their enlistment. And furthermore, they carry out this patriotism with incredible pride, understandable and appropriate pride in the way they participate with their honor and color guards at veterans events throughout our state. This memorial and these amendments are really a very appropriate and important recognition of their sacrifice and their service and their unique contribution to our society, especially given the history of our nation's birth. And so, Mr. Speaker, I encourage all of our colleagues to honor our Native veterans by voting yes on this important legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this point, let me as much time as the gentlelady from Minnesota can use, Ms. McCollum, co-chair of the Native American Caucus in the House.
The gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized for as much time as she wishes to consume.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of the Native American Veterans Memorial Amendments Act. Native Americans have served in our armed forces at higher rates than any other ethnic group, even while being denied the right to vote and full citizenship in this country. Their contributions include 27 recipients of the Medal of Honor and code talkers whose native languages became the unbreakable code, keeping America safe, keeping America strong. A permanent memorial for these brave men and women will ensure all Americans are able to honor and remember their sacrifice. While construction of such a memorial has been authorized since 1994, this bill offers critical amendments to make it a reality. It allows the National Museum of the American Indian to build the memorial on its grounds and permits the museum to work with the National Congress of American Indians in raising funding. This honor is past due for the thousands of Native American veterans and service members and their families, and I urge my colleagues to join all of us in giving thanks for their service by supporting this bill. With that, I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentleman from Oklahoma.
At this time, I'd like to yield as much time as the gentleman from Montana may consume, Mr. Daines.
The gentleman from Montana is recognized for as much time as he wishes to use.
I want to thank Congressman Mullen for the work he has done in leading this important bill and bringing it to the floor, as well as the bipartisan support from my distinguished friend and member from Arizona, Koehl, as we're bringing something together here that is bipartisan in nature for a very important reason. You know, Montana is the proud home of 7 federally recognized tribes, along with a state-recognized tribe, the Little Shell. Montana's tribes not only represent an important part of Montana's history and our heritage. In fact, more than 2,500 Montana tribal members are veterans who serve as true examples of service, of bravery, of patriotism. Last month, I was blessed with the opportunity to meet with some of those Montana veterans, their families, and other tribal members in Washington, D.C. for a congressional gold medal ceremony honoring the Native American code talkers who served in both world wars. In fact, it was a special moment. I brought several of those members of the Crow tribe, descendants of these Crow code talkers, to the House floor for a tour after Congress had adjourned. And here we were in this great chamber as these members of the Crow tribe presented a blessing in their native language that was helpful in allowing us to win the world wars. This recognition was long overdue and well-deserved for these brave and selfless men and women. I think it's important that all of our Native American veterans receive the honor they deserve. This bill would help a memorial commemorating our Native American veterans to be constructed on the National American Indian Museum grounds here in Washington, D.C. This memorial will serve as an important symbol of gratitude for the thousands of Native men and women who have fought to keep us free. I hope all members will join me today in supporting this effort to show our Native American veterans the appreciation and honor that is most deserved.
Yields back his time. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no further speakers. I just want to conclude by again thanking the sponsor of the legislation and I think to point out the obvious that this legislation is important, its timing is important, and the fact that this recognition per capita for the contributions to our nation in military service for Native American peoples and tribes across this country is a very important one. It speaks to real loyalty, real love of the land, and real love of this nation. I'm proud to be here and to lend my support to this legislation and to yield back the remainder of our time.
Yields back his time. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
I'd like to thank my colleague from Arizona and his support on this very important piece of legislation. We have no further speakers, so at this time we'd yield back and put it back in your hands.
Gentleman from Oklahoma yields back his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2319 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, 2/3 being the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker,
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
On that, I would like to ask for the yeas and nays to be recorded.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking a vote on the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. What purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass S. 1471.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 1471, an act to authorize the Secretary of Veterans Affairs and the Secretary of the Army to reconsider decisions to inter or honor the memory of a person in a national cemetery and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Miller, and the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Mushu, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members would have 5 legislative days with which to revise and extend their remarks and add any extraneous material and include that material in Senate 1471.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for as much time as he wishes to consume.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of Senate 1471, the Alicia Koehl Respect for National Cemeteries Act. This bill would grant authority to the Department of Veterans Affairs to reconsider the decision to inter or memorialize an individual within a national cemetery in situations where it is later discovered that the deceased committed a capital crime. Currently, Section 2411 of Title 38, the United States Code prohibits the interment or memorialization of persons who committed a federal or state capital crime. Nonetheless, situations have arisen where the entity, such as a funeral home or the individual who is charged with scheduling the internment or memorialization of a decedent, either does not know of the decedent's crime or does not truthfully report such crime to federal cemetery officials. In situations where a funeral home had no knowledge that a decedent was involved in a capital crime at the time of the burial request, VA actually lacks statutory authority to reconsider internment or memorialization decisions. Simply put, individuals who are buried or memorialized within national cemeteries cannot be disinterred on the basis of subsequently received information. Mr. Speaker, S. 1471 would provide this authority to VA as well as to the Department of Defense in the case of Arlington National Cemetery. VA supports this bill as it would provide the Department with the ability to redress interment cases where eligibility is invalidated by information that is learned after a burial. This bill would also specifically direct the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to disinter the remains of Michael LaShawn Anderson from Fort Custer National Cemetery, as it was Mr. Anderson who murdered Alicia Dawn Koehl prior to taking his own life. In that case, the funeral home charged with Mr. Anderson's burial was unaware of the incident. Thus, they did not properly report the crime, and Fort Custer National Cemetery provided a military funeral. The interment of Mr. Anderson was brought to the attention of the Indiana congressional delegation, and I want to thank my colleague, Ms. Brooks, for highlighting this tragic incident and for offering companion legislation to S. 1471. I also want to thank our colleagues in the Senate for addressing this need and for passing Senate 1471. I encourage all of my colleagues to support this legislation. At this time, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Florida reserves his time. The gentleman from Maine, Mr. Michoud, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he wishes to consume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support this legislation to allow the VA or the Secretary of the Army to reconsider their decision to inter individuals at our Veterans National Cemeteries, to include Arlington National Cemetery. With this legislation, individuals who may have committed a federal or state capital crime but were not convicted by reason of unavailability for trial due to death or flight to avoid prosecution may be considered for disinterment. Being buried in our national cemeteries is one of the highest honors our nation bestows upon veterans and their dependents for their service and sacrifice. This legislation also closes a loophole in the current law. Currently, veterans and their dependents who have been convicted of capital crimes may not be buried in Arlington National Cemetery or any national cemetery. If there is a mistake and they are inappropriately buried in one of these cemeteries, the Army and/or VA cannot correct that mistake. This legislation would correct this issue and allows the Secretaries of the Army and the VA to reconsider the original interment and exhume the body for interment elsewhere. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Maine reserves his time. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield such time as she may consume the member who brought this attention to our attention and to the full committee, Ms. Brooks of Indiana.
The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized for as much time as she wishes to use.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, and I want to thank the distinguished gentleman from Florida and his subcommittee chairman, Mr. Runyon, for bringing up this important piece of legislation today, Senate 1471. Mr. Speaker, during this season of Christmas, we seek to surround ourselves with our family and our friends to give thanks for the blessings in our life. But unfortunately, one family from my district will be spending yet another Christmas season without their wife, without their mother, without their daughter-in-law because of a senseless act of violence that took place at an apartment complex in Indianapolis, Indiana on May 30th, 2012. On that date, Michael Anderson, a deranged Army veteran, went on a shooting rampage that took the life of Alicia Koehl, who was an apartment complex manager. After taking her life, he also severely injured 3 others. Mr. Anderson shot Alicia 13 times before taking his own life. Alicia's killing left a hole in communities throughout Indiana. She was not only a mother of 2 young children and a loving wife, she was a Girl Scout leader, Volunteer of the Year at Spring Mill Elementary School, and an active member of her church. Paul Koehl, Alicia's husband, provided testimony to the House Veterans Affairs Committee that Alicia was the glue that held our family together. He continued her motto in life was live, laugh, and love, and that the saying could be found in almost every room of their home. He finally relayed her contagious optimism by telling that her smile and gentle nature never failed to light up a room. So it's no wonder that her passing triggered an outpouring of sympathy throughout our state, candlelight vigils being held in our own Indianapolis City Council, formally memorializing her as someone whose very presence in our community was a stabilizing influence which lends a sense of purpose and direction. Mr. Speaker, you can only imagine the indignation when in the midst of their grief, family and friends found out that the killer of Alicia was allowed burial in a national cemetery with full military honors. This is in spite of a federal law explicitly forbidding the Department of Veterans Affairs from interring anyone who has committed a capital crime, including those never formally convicted. At the request of Alicia's family and friends, Senator Coates and I began working on this case to rectify the mistake made by our National Cemeteries Association. The NCA informed us that they lacked the authority to disinter Michael Anderson, or the ability to rectify their horrific mistake if something like this should even happen again. Mr. Speaker, this is unacceptable. I'm outraged not only that the Koehl family has had to endure yet another injustice after Alicia's life was needlessly cut short, but also that our brave servicemen and women who in some cases who have given the ultimate sacrifice to their nation are buried next to a murderous criminal. The legislation before the House today will simply give the Department of Veterans Affairs the ability to reconsider internment of veterans who lost their privilege of internment in our national cemeteries by committing a capital offense. Our nation's cemeteries shouldn't be tarnished because of a legislative technicality, and the bill before us will close this loophole. Our bravest men and women should be buried next to fellow heroes, and today we can make sure they always are. So I'm proud to be a sponsor of the House version of this bill that garnered the support of all Hoosier representatives, and I want to thank them for coming together in a bicameral and bipartisan way to get behind this meaningful and important piece of legislation. I want to encourage all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and thank them for coming together and to give closure to the Koehl family, restore a sense of honor to our national cemeteries, and improve the protocols so an injustice like this can never happen again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
The gentlelady from Indiana yields back her time. The gentleman from Florida reserves. The gentleman from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we can take a meaningful step to ensure that the sanctity of our national cemeteries. These grounds are hollow for the men and women that fought selfishly on our behalf. And with that, I'd encourage my colleagues to support this legislation, and I have no further speakers, so I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Maine yields back his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I too encourage our colleagues to join us in support of Senate 1471. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida yields back his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate 1471? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative. Gentleman from Florida.
On that, I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8, Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3212 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3212, a bill to ensure compliance with the 1980 Hague Convention on the civil aspects of international child abduction by countries with which the United States enjoys reciprocal obligations to establish procedures for the prompt return of children abducted to other countries and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, and the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Snyder, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to ask that members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to yield myself such time as I might consume. And, Speaker, every year, more than 1,000 American families are confronted with the nightmare of their child being abducted to a foreign country by one parent in violation of legal custody and access rights beyond the reach of U.S. courts, beyond the reach of law enforcement. This illegal break in the tie between the child and the left-behind American mother or father is a tragedy, and many of us personally have constituents facing these wrenching separations in the family. More than 30 years ago, the Hague Convention on the Civil Aspects of Child Abduction was created to provide a simplified mechanism for returning children to their countries of habitual residence so that parental rights are determined by applicable laws rather than by the act of abduction of that child. Today, the United States has agreement with 75 Hague partner countries, and that has helped to return many American children safely home. But unfortunately, agreeing to the Hague Convention and complying with it are not the same thing. And countries sometimes do not abide by their obligations under that Hague Convention. In those countries, there is a heightened risk that a child could be kept there with impunity. American parents need to know about this situation, and they need to know that, especially before planning or permitting travel to such destinations, that this in fact could happen. And this bill will strengthen the incentives and the tools that the Department of State has to address these unresolved abduction cases. It will also require the United States to identify and take action concerning countries that demonstrate a pattern of noncompliance with the obligations to return American children. And its enhanced annual reporting will provide American parents and judges with a clearer picture of actual Hague compliance and the risks of non-return associated with travel to certain countries. I want to thank the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, for his tireless work on behalf of left-behind American parents over the last several years. His efforts have kept hope alive for hundreds of other American parents who only want to be reunited with their children. And, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves his time. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of H.R. 3212, the Sean and David Goldman International Child Abduction Prevention and Return Act, and yield myself as much time as I may assume.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he wishes.
I'd like to begin by thanking my colleague on the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, for his dedicated and tireless efforts on this critical issue, making a difference for families. There are few crimes more heart-wrenching than child abduction. As a parent myself, I can't imagine the anguish a mother or father goes through when their child is abducted by their partner and taken to another country. These left-behind parents currently have little leverage to have their children returned home. They are often at the mercy of foreign courts with different cultural conceptions of custody and what is or is not in the child's best interest. Unfortunately, there are an increasing number of international parental child abductions. The State Department reported that in 2012, there were 1,144 children abducted from a parent in the United States and taken abroad. The most effective tool the United States has to help return abducted children is the 1980 Hague Convention on the civil aspects of international child abduction. This treaty creates a global standard and requires signatories to return abducted children to the country of the child's habitual residence for a custody hearing. Regrettably, there are significant gaps in the Hague Treaty framework. The treaty has no enforcement mechanism, and 40% of abducted children are taken to non-Hague compliant countries. This leaves far too many parents with no viable options. The purpose of this legislation before us today is to fill those gaps, providing pained parents with the appropriate tools to bring their children home. Specifically, H.R. 3212 encourages the State Department to enter into MOUs with countries that bring them in line with accepted standards and return these children home. In addition, this bill gives the President the power to sanction countries that demonstrate persistent failure in returning abducted children. The legislation will also help us monitor progress in achieving greater compliance worldwide with the Hague standards by requiring reports on child abduction cases and on U.S. government efforts to encourage their compliance. Sadly, international parental child abduction is an underreported and often overlooked crime which dramatically and traumatically impacts the lives of the children and the parents involved. We need to send a message to the world that we take Hague compliance and returning abducted children back to the United States seriously. This bill represents an important step forward in empowering the President and the State Department to enforce the Hague Convention and to bring more countries in line with its standards. Mr. Chairman, I encourage all of my colleagues to support this important legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Illinois reserves his time. Gentleman from California, Mr. Royce.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to yield 6 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and